Greetings, AP European History scholars from the high school library. This is your review of Unit 9, European Society and Culture at the End of the 19th Century, starting from top to bottom on the review sheet for this unit. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are the authors of the Communist Manifesto, in which they describe the history of mankind as being a history of class struggle between the haves and the have-nots. In our current age, the time when they wrote, they say the struggle now has taken the form of the bourgeoisie, the middle-class capitalists, against the proletariat. These are the factory workers, not the poor in general, but those working in industry. And their call is for the proletariat to throw off their chains. They have nothing left to lose, and they're calling for revolution. The context that this is written in is during the Industrial Revolution, long hours, low wages, poor, dangerous working conditions, and Karl Marx has this prescription. He has a solution for human suffering, and he says this is actually historically inevitable. This will happen. He's saying what differentiates his vision of socialism is that his vision is scientific, it is historical, unlike the utopians which he mocked, and we talked about the utopian socialists earlier. Charles Darwin is the author of Origin of Species and Descent of Man, in which he puts forward the idea of biological evolution, natural selection, survival of the fittest, and his ideas are a challenge to religious values of the time, the religious idea that there is a God who has created us with purpose, and Darwin is saying, no, man, there is a material cause, there is no purpose, evolution is truly random, and this is a challenge to the Christian faith and certainly to the book of Genesis, chapter 1. Copernicus and Galileo, the AP is asking you to do this idea of synthesis where you're looking for a common situation, either past or present, from the period that you'll be writing about. And Copernicus and Galileo are putting forward this idea of heliocentrism, which is a challenge to geocentrism, which is supported by the Bible itself. If you take the scriptures literally, that the sun sets and the sun rises, and you say no, it is the it is the earth that is moving and not the sun, well, you would appear to be challenging the scriptures, and Galileo is put before the Inquisition and is put under house arrest and is forced to recant. So this is a similar situation of faith versus knowledge, or so it would seem at the time. Social Darwinism and Herbert Spencer, he is the proponent of social Darwinism, is the idea that natural selection, survival of the fittest, applies to society, and it's often used as a justification for the wealthy's riches, and an explanation for poverty, that the poor are somehow less fit, that they are less moral, they're less hardworking, and at best it explains a way to get out of poverty, that if you work hard, save your money, act morally, you too can succeed. It certainly is a rationalization for conquest abroad later. Our next unit will be on imperialism overseas. The Europeans will go on a major colony acquisition at the tail end of the 1800s, early 1900s in Africa and in Asia. And social Darwinism says that certain races, certainly Asians and Africans, are not as fit as the Europeans and really should be under their tutelage. Again, a rationalization to basically exploit them. Realist art, the goal of realist art is to depict reality. And partly it is used to hold up a dim reality for the purpose of reform, but not necessarily. You have this painting by Jean-François Millet called The Gleaners, and it's a picture, a portrait of these three women who are picking up wheat that has fallen to the ground after the harvest. And this picking up stray pieces of wheat is called gleaning. This is a very famous realist art, and this is much in contrast to Romanticism. Remember, Romanticism depicts sort of the beauty of nature and sort of this idealized art. Edward Bernstein and Evolutionary Socialism and his Erfurt program. Bernstein, among others, is saying that socialism can be achieved democratically. He observed in Britain that the middle class was not falling into the ranks of the proletariat, but was actually getting bigger. The middle class was growing and accumulating in wealth and had a fairly good standard of living that was rising. And Bernstein is saying you don't need a violent revolution. And the conflict here with Lenin and the Bolsheviks is guys like Bernstein and the Fabians in Great Britain and those who work through trade unions to get higher wages, they're basically selling out. Lenin was calling for a total control of the means of production by the government via socialism on its way to a classless society, which would be communism. So Lenin wants the whole pie, not just a bigger piece of it. Friedrich Nietzsche is this famous critic of Christianity. He says that Christianity glorifies passivity and weakness, and he is a proponent of nihilism, that life has no meaning aside from what we make it. And he gave a call to reject all received religious and moral principles. And Nietzsche is calling for humans to live heroically and to live daringly and to throw aside Christianity. And he's got this famous phrase, God is dead, and we have killed him. Otto von Bismarck and the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Remember, Otto von Bismarck is this guy that hammers modern Germany together out of all these disparate states in the series of wars in the 1860s through the Franco-Prussian War of 70-71. But one of the things he does as he's putting Germany together is he is marginalizing this very large, very popular socialist party, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SDP, and he's taking some of their ideas, in particular old age pensions, disability pay, and health benefits. These things are very modern for certainly the United States and very modern in 20th century things that social democratic welfare states will be achieving after World War II. But Bismarck is putting them into place at the end of the 1800s. And what's remarkable here is he is a reactionary. He's not for liberalism and democracy and all that, but he is willing to rob the Social Democrats of their ideas for the purpose of weakening them and strengthening support for the government. Remember, this is called realpolitik, doing what is practical, what works, not being tied to any ideology. Similarity in changes in the working class and bourgeois families during the Industrial Revolution. Well, there is, big picture, there is a rising standard of living and more education opportunity for the common workers' family. What is probably most common, though, is this urbanization, people moving to cities where there's factories, where there's businesses. The growing middle class here in the cities is seeing this ideal that women should stay home and that women should not work. Differences in the working classes and the bourgeois families. Well, one of the big things here is, again, gender roles. The woman from the middle class is supposed to stay home and raise patriotic, Christian, literate little kids. And if a woman were to work at all, it should be before they're married in women's jobs, nursing and teaching and clerical positions and secretarial work and telegraph operators. But poor women certainly are working. Women are working as maids, which are as domestics, same thing here, or again in women's jobs. And many women are working in factories because you can hire a woman more cheaply than a man. So the bourgeois, families increasingly are seeing a stay-at-home mom, the man going off to work, whereas the poor families are seeing the woman definitely working. How these thinkers challenge conventional European beliefs and morality. Charles Darwin, of course, the idea of evolution here is challenging Christian faith itself. Karl Marx says that what drives man is not religion but economics. Man needs to create every day his means of subsistence, and the primary driving motivator of human behavior is economics. Albert Einstein says that matter is not fixed, but it's changing. Remember his famous E equals mc squared, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. And time and space are relative to the observer. What you see is relative and is not fixed. And he's challenging Newtonian physics. Sigmund Freud says that psychiatric or psychological problems are not spiritual, they're not moral, but they're simply maladjustment. They're a suppression of desires, which rather than there being sin, which maybe drives people into guilt, he says there is suppressed desires, many of them which should not be suppressed, which should be talked about and through psychoanalysis. How could the lives of European workers be improved according to these four groups? Well, liberals, greater individual freedom and limited government, greater democracy, greater freedom. Conservatives, proper submission to authority. There's that famous saying, throne, altar, and nobility, that you should respect the king, you should respect right religion, whether that would be the Catholic Church or whether that would be Church of England or the Lutheran Church in Protestant countries. Socialist/Marxist, life could be better through revolution. Now again, there's this division. There are the democratic socialists, the Fabians and the revisionists, and Lenin will call them accommodationists and opportunists, but this idea that there needs to be a reduction in the power of capitalists to keep what they have, and there should be a shared ownership of the means of production. Means of production is the fancy Marxist word for factories and fields and ports and docks and businesses and railroads and banks. The means of production should be shared as far as ownership. Syndicalism is the idea that labor unions wielding power through strikes will bring redistribution through higher wages, that the labor unions will force the redistribution of wealth. We just talked here about women, which was the next one on the sheet here. And why didn't Europe experience a violent revolution as Marx predicted by the end of the 1800s? Well, a number of things. You do have guys like Otto von Bismarck who are robbing socialist ideas for the sake of getting support for his conservative government. But in other countries, through unions, through democratic socialism, Fabianism, revisionism, you're seeing through democracy, through increased democratic participation, you're seeing the betterment of people's lives. There is a growing middle class which is sharing in national wealth, at least in Western Europe. There's an increased standard of living, and this is what you can purchase with what you can make. There is increased urbanization, use of electricity and steel and chemicals and petroleum, and you've got expanded transportation, better public health. And what you're seeing here is Europe is growing wealthier. Europe is growing freer, and this wealth is being shared, certainly imperfectly, most imperfectly in Eastern Europe, places like autocratic, dictatorial Russia under the Tsar. But in Western Europe, people can see that there is progress. Remember the last unit when we discussed Disraeli and Gladstone? You have the second and third Reform Acts increasing the number of people who can vote. You have money that's going for public housing and public schools and public sanitation. You have the professionalization of the military ranks and government jobs and the opening of universities to people of all religions. There certainly is positive change, democratic change happening, which is going to thwart the call for violence. And that change doesn't happen democratically in Russia, so you will have the communist revolution in a place where it's not expected. In 1917 in Tsarist Russia. That's coming up in the next unit we will do. Impact of science and technology on European society. Well, this I just sort of went over some of this in the last topic here, but what you're seeing is you're seeing the movement from rural areas from the countryside to urban cities, the growth of factories, the use of electricity supplementing steam power and certainly water power in the early 1800s. You've got this growing middle class, and you've got these things which characterize the second industrial revolution: electricity, steel, chemicals, petroleum, as opposed to textile and coal and iron in the early industrial revolution of the late 1700s, early 1800s. Why the rise of anti-Semitism in the late 19th century? Well, part of this is nationalism. There's that phrase, what nation does a Jew have? Can you be a Frenchman or a Pole or a Russian and be Jewish? The rise of nationalism, putting together countries and promoting patriotism and nationalism in countries that do exist, is going to marginalize Jews who are being perceived as being outsiders. You have liberalism. Liberalism is increased human freedom, increased human rights, human liberty, human participation in government, increased democracy, and limited government. You have, as following the Napoleonic Code, where Napoleon, who's somewhat indifferent to any sort of religious absolutism, he's spreading religious freedom, and the Jews in Western Europe are assimilating. They're moving into society, they're intermarrying, they're moving into the middle class, into universities, and liberalism is going to be a great boon to the Jewish population, but there's going to be this also with the growth of nationalism, this resentment by some who are anti-Semitic that Jews have left the place where they're supposed to be, on the margins, in the ghettos, on the edges. You also have Darwinism, and Darwinism is going to say that there are certain species that are inferior, and social Darwinism is going to say that some races are inferior, and during the age of imperialism, you're going to see this as Europeans move into Africa and Asia and take these people over for their own good, supposedly. And Jews are seen by many as a separate race. They're not part of us. They're part of that scary other. So these are some reasons why there's anti-Semitism, and certainly they're scapegoats for things like, losing a war against the Germans and the Dreyfus Affair in France, and later this scapegoating after World War I that somebody must have stabbed Germany in the back, and it's going to be bankers and munitions makers and Jews and those who are not sufficiently German and patriotic. So these things all thrown together will see a rise of anti-Semitism. Jewish responses. Well, some responses are a commitment to work for secularism, to work for greater assimilation, greater democracy, greater freedom, a trust in the democratic ideal. There are going to be Jews who will pitch their lot in with socialism, that socialism is adamant that religion is a crock, religion is a scam, that religion is flowers on the chains of the enslaved masses, and that if religion is something to be tossed out, well, many secular Jews are on board with this because they want religion no longer to be something to be used against them by the Christian majority. You've got Zionism. This is a call for Jews to go back and recreate their homeland in the Middle East. And then you have immigration, certainly in Eastern Europe, where the Tsarist autocracy and nationalism is attacking Jewish communities in Russia and Ukraine and Poland. Jews are fleeing by the millions over the decades at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, to places like the United States. The First International was founded by French and British trade union leaders, and it is an international discussion of how to push forward the socialist agenda. And there's several other internationals that will meet after that. And at the First International and other international meetings, they're meeting in London because London they're free. Remember, Karl Marx is booted out of Germany, and Lenin will be tossed out of Tsarist Russia. The socialists will be talking about the means. What do we mean by, how do we enact this socialism? Max Weber is a sociologist who is going to argue that what drives modern capitalism in Western Europe is going to be the religious anxiety. And he's going to say the root of modern-day capitalism are the Puritans, who are on the edge here of, they don't fit into the rural Anglican nobility and farming class here, that the Puritans are going to be working hard and having these characteristics of sobriety and frugality and hard work and honesty, that these Calvinists, these Christian ideals, which are going to pay off in economic prosperity, that really what they're doing is, because they believe in election, because these Puritans do not have a guarantee of their salvation, that their prosperity is what is going to be the indication that God has shown his favor on them, and that capitalism is demanding economic freedom, which is something that the Puritans are asking. They're asking for religious freedom. They're demanding religious freedom. Religious freedom and economic freedom are going hand in hand, and this capitalism, again, is being driven by religious anxiety. And there's a number of these thinkers who are saying that it's not rationality anymore. We're not talking about the Enlightenment, but it's religious anxiety for Max Weber. It is psychological maladjustment and repression of desires for Albert Einstein, and it is raw economic need, not desire. It's not. We're not going to agree here, but for Karl Marx, it is the need to survive every day. It's your stomach that basically drives human mankind to class struggle. Some other things at the very bottom of the review sheet, some terms to be familiar with. Bloody Sunday, 1905. We don't know exactly how many, maybe between 500, 1,500 protesters will march on the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg asking for reform for workers, and they're being led by a priest, an Orthodox priest, and they've got banners pledging their loyalty to the Tsar, but they're asking for the Tsar as their father to help them out. And this is all happening at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, which is lost by the Russians. It's humiliating. This little Asian power has defeated this huge, supposedly European powerhouse. And this is one of these protests, and the Tsar guns them down. The Tsar's troops, the Cossacks, murder. Again, it's could be up to 1,000 or so, and this is the slaughter. And this is going to lead to more protests in Russia, and eventually, after several elections, the Tsar, in his October manifesto, will allow elections which will lead to a legislative Duma. And when I said several elections, it's several elections until he gets the conservative Duma that he wants. It's very hamstrung, very limited. But because of this riot, because of the loss of this war to the Japanese, 1904, 1905, the Tsar is kind of pushed into allowing people to have more say. Pogroms are these assaults on Jewish communities, primarily in Eastern Europe, many of them directed by the Tsarist regime. Soviets are workers' councils, these cells that have infiltrated the army, the navy, unions, factories. These are going to be the revolutionary catalyst that will rise up in 1917 in Russia, leading the revolution that is to come. Christian responses to changes in the 1800s. Within Protestantism, you have what is called theological liberalism, and this is an attempt to make Christianity palatable to the modern age, which is scientific, which is rationalist, which is born out of the Enlightenment. And what you're having here with David Strauss and Friedrich Schleiermacher and some of these liberal thinkers is that Jesus is a myth, that the scriptures are telling us a story. And a myth is not a lie, but a myth is an attempt to explain that which we do not know. And now that science can explain where we come from and where we're going, aka Charles Darwin, so what good is Christianity, is the Christian faith? Well, Jesus is a moral example. Jesus is an example of moral character. And if miracles are not scientific or rational, certainly we can take from the scriptures the call to love our neighbor, the call to personal striving and hard work and honesty and frugality and sobriety, and caring for others and respect for authority. And these things which make for a strong nation, which make for a healthy people, which make for a prosperous community. This is what theological liberalism promotes, the moral values that you would see in the scriptures minus the miracles. And one person that comes to mind here, if you had sort of a synthetic question, would be Desiderius Erasmus. Remember, he talks about this Philosophia Christi, that we should have the philosophy of Christ, that the corruption, the immorality that's happening at the time, pre-Reformation, that he's not pushing for doctrine. He's not a Luther who's worried about the salvation of his soul. He's a critic of the church in Praise of Folly, who's calling for morality, for an end of clerical corruption. So just a thought here connecting Desiderius Erasmus with the theological liberals of the tail end of the 1900s. In the Catholic Church, you have kind of a clampdown on a claim to authority. The Pope, after losing the Papal States and control over Rome, is setting up the First Vatican Council. 1869, the Pope is granted the doctrine of papal infallibility. Granted would be, Catholics would disagree with this phrase here. Something that the Pope already has had is confirmed, but the stating it boldly here is something new, that the Pope, in matters of doctrine, not in morality, not that the Pope is unsinful, but in matters of doctrine, the Pope is infallible. What he says is true. And then in a certain way, this is a moat. This is a barricade against ideas like nihilism and Nietzsche and Freud's ideas on suppressing bad desires is wrong, and Charles Darwin's ideas of materialistic evolution. Syllabus of Errors is an encyclical. This is an official papal document which renounces contemporary science, philosophy, and political democracy, which are contrary to Catholic morality, to Christian moral values. Another encyclical to know besides the Syllabus of Errors is Rerum Novarum, and this is a denunciation of Marxism, a denunciation of socialism, the call for class struggle, the call for hatred and anger and war against classes. The Pope denounces this, but he does okay unions, which is a huge thing here. As unions are organizing and workers are trying to get back some of this ground they've lost to the capitalist bourgeoisie, the Pope is saying go for it. The Pope is saying that it is okay to peacefully press back for better working conditions and to reclaim your dignity as a worker. So there you have it. This is your quick drive-by review for the test for Unit 9 on European society and culture at the end of the 19th century. All right, scholars, study hard, review, and see you there at the test.